Welcome back, everyone, to another hospitality law seminar produced by HospitalityLawyer.com. Today's topic, property taxes for hotels, a lawyer's perspective. Joining us today is Mr. David Wilkes. David is a partner in the Herman, Katz, Cangemi, Wilkes, and Clyne law firm in New York. He has over 25 years of experience concentrated in commercial property tax disputes and advisory due diligence services to national and global portfolios. He's also involved in counseling foreign governments. He's a director of the International Property Tax Institute and a co-founder and president of the National Association of Property Tax Attorneys. He is designated Counselor of Real Estate and a fellow of the London-based RICS, the largest organization of property advisors in the world. David holds a master's degree in real estate valuation and finance from NYU's Schack Real Estate Institute and a law degree from Boston University, as well as a certificate in hotel real estate investments and asset management from the renowned Cornell Nolan School of Hotel Administration. We're actually very fortunate with all of his extracurricular activities that David is alive to be with us today, because in addition to being a pilot, he's a sailor, he's a golfer, and he climbs rocks. So David, that's
golfing is by far the most dangerous.
Especially if you drive the cart after a couple of beers. I agree completely.
Absolutely.
Well, David, it's a pleasure to have you today. My goodness, what a tremendous resume you have. And just before we get into the slide deck that you've prepared, generally speaking, this property tax debate, it just seems to me has been going on for quite some time. And I know we're going to get into it, but is that your feeling as well? Is it still kind of divided about the evaluation or the valuation process, I guess I should say?
It's absolutely as divided as it ever was. I just recently returned from a conference. It's still the thing that people talk about. There's still a significant divide. And I know that what you're referring to is the question of how do you separate the real estate from the going concern? And that's because the real estate is what's being taxed. And so assessors like to go after things that they shouldn't be taxing. And so this continues to be a debate. We can get a little bit more into it as we go along. But just, sort of from a high level, I think that part of the problem is that this is, treated as kind of a religious quest by both sides. And ultimately, there's not really an absolute right answer. It's really a question of who has the most credible methodology. And so, yeah, the debate keeps going, and I'm not sure that we're ever going to come to an absolute concrete answer.
Well, that's a good place to start then. Let's take a look at this first slide you set up for us. And so you pose the question why hotels are prone to overtaxation. And that's kind of a scary thought. I mean, everybody wants to, well, I shouldn't say that. Everybody wants to pay their fair share of taxes. Let's assume that morally people feel
right.
like they want to pay their fair share.
My clients always want to pay the right number.
But that's a great question to pose. So why is that? Why are we prone in this industry to being overtaxed?
Well, you really started the conversation off in the right place by asking the question about the debate in valuation. And you look, ultimately, in most jurisdictions, there's a distinction between being taxed on real estate and being taxed on whatever else there is. And that could be FF&E, intangibles, things like that. Some states will tax on the personal property, but what we're here to talk about is the tax on the real estate. And when a buyer goes to buy a hotel, they're not that interested in what's just the bricks and mortar worth. They're interested in the business. They buy a business, they buy it as a going concern. When you bring in a flag, that's got value to it for a host of reasons that have nothing to do with the actual real estate. So and with all that being said, the thing that we tend to look at first is what was the sale price. That tends to be our guiding light when it comes to the question of what's the property worth. Not so for hotels. And that's why hotels tend to be prone to overtaxation. Very often, that sale price includes more than just the real estate. And as you mentioned, there's a hot debate, and it's been going on now for well over a decade among very highly regarded appraisers on both sides as to how do you separate out. And I know we're not going to get into the the nitty gritty of the appraisal process here, but suffice to say, how you separate out the real estate from the rest is the tough part. And I guess I would add on top of that is that the assessor is generally not in a great position to make that call. So they tend to look at a sale price. They tend to, even if they're aware of the issues, they probably are going to overshoot the mark, and that's kind of where we end up coming in.
And David, is it fair that if I'm a seller, I want to value my property, and my business as much as I possibly can, right? But then for tax purposes, I'm not inclined to do just that. And so, am I just constantly walking that line?
You are, as a hotel owner, I think that's right. There are some sales in which the components of value may be better documented, and that can be helpful. But I know, and look, I'm the property tax guy. I'm not the really smart guys who deal with income tax and the transactional piece. So I sort of stay in my lane. So what I can say is there may be other reasons in a transaction that are what you might call higher level reasons for structuring it, for documenting it the way it's documented. And that may not be helpful to somebody in my shoes who's dealing with the property tax. So, there could be a whole bunch of reasons why a transaction kind of looks on paper the way it does. But ultimately, from my point of view and for the assessor's point of view, what matters is what's just the real estate worth. And, how you get there can be a tough question. We can't just, generally speaking, unless you have a brand new hotel, straight up construction, you generally are not able to just look at the cost to build a hotel.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And so just real quickly, just a last thought here. I think I heard you say that in some jurisdictions, they just focus on the real estate. In others, they also tax what we would call in the law the personal property. In FF&E, for instance, in a hotel.
Right.
Did I get that right?
You did. I'm not sure if this is the right number, but at last count, about 39 states out of the United States would tax some kind of personal property. Now they're all different. Those taxation schemes will look a little different in each state, but approximately 39 states. And by the way, the personal property tax tends to be on the wane. There are states that are deciding that it's not worth the trouble, I guess, or there are other ways to tax you that are more efficient. But those are states that do look at the personal property like the FF&E and so on. New York is an example of a state where the only thing that's taxed is the real estate. So for example, if you're dealing with a large hotel in New York, you're going to want to focus on what's just the real estate component worth. And that's true of many states. The other thing to kind of point out about that is that the two systems for taxation, the taxation of the real estate, the taxation of the personal property are completely different. And I'm not going to go into that too much here either. I don't want to bore the listeners, but just kind of the sort of the fundamental way that you could look at that difference is that for the real estate, it's the government, the assessor, who's coming out and saying, I think this is what it's worth. And now you as the owner are in the position of having to prove that that number is wrong, that value is wrong. On the personal property side, so for instance, FF&E, the owner is the one making the declaration of what the value is, and it's usually based on things like a cost less depreciation or something based on the actual book value of those tangible assets, and making a declaration, and then it's up to the municipality to say whether or not they agree or disagree. So the two processes, they're really different. They're treated differently. Valuation for real estate is often done by a real estate appraiser. Valuation of the rest of the stuff is usually done in a more accounting fashion. So it's just very different processes, and so it's really important to kind of keep them separate, and it really does make a big difference in terms of the overall tax that the owner is going to pay.
That was a great distinction and clarification. Thank you. Very helpful. And just to put it in context, before we get to this next slide, there's a lot of money at stake here.
There is, it depends on where you go in the U.S. Some states have a relatively minimal tax, but a lot of states depend heavily on the property tax. As particularly you go to places like the Northeast, your property tax can be up to 50% of your expenses. And I know that the property tax goes up and down a bit, but I tend to look at the property tax like a fixed operating expense. It's significant. It's always there. And at the same time, it's one of the fixed expenses that you can actually really do the most about. It's the kind of thing where even, if you compare it to things like your income tax, where you get that number and you try to do your best to get it to the lowest possible. They always talk about tax evasion versus tax avoidance. So you want to try to avoid unnecessary taxes, not evade them. But that's something that's pretty hard to do, but your real estate tax is the kind of thing where you can actually, in many cases, have a real face-to-face conversation with the people that are taxing you and show them why some of their assumptions may not be right. So yeah, it's a big deal. And it really, as we've come through the last couple of years, particularly where the hospitality sector has been hit so hard, it's one of the first places that an owner can look to really kind of improve their bottom line.
Thanks for distinguishing between avoidance and evasion for all the listeners
of course, and we all know that.
Special attention to that, but that was very helpful. So, well, let's hop onto this next slide, because you were just talking about differences in terms of different states, different jurisdictions. They do that. So, as your title points out, we're the most fractured country. It's different all over, and so developing an expertise in these jurisdictions must be very challenging. But have you gleaned over all these years of practice, you and your associates, that there are some consistent processes that people need to think about no matter the jurisdiction?
Yeah, you framed it very well, because it really is a bit of both. And anybody who tells you they're the jack of all trades who does it all is not really presenting you with the complete picture. And so what I often think is what you really need is sort of a quarterback who can oversee the portfolio, really, look for the hot spots. And when I say hot spots, I mean, taxes that really look like they deserve attention, because not every single assessment necessarily needs attention. But, if you track a portfolio on an ongoing basis and you really develop some metrics, you can quickly spot where the problem areas are. And it's not just that an assessment is out of whack, but can I do anything about it? And so those are the kinds of questions that I often talk about, top-down versus bottom-up approach. It's important from a management standpoint for a portfolio to be able to take this top-down approach. And some portfolios will have dedicated tax managers who do this function. Some don't, and they outsource it to people like me, who help to kind of look at the portfolio and give some advice on where to focus. But at the same time, I'm not the guy. If there's a problem in Chicago, I'm connecting up with the guy that I trust in Chicago who's on the front line, because this is very much a relationship-driven practice. It's something where it's important to, you get credibility by showing up a lot and over a period of time. And the municipal officials get to know that what you have to say is reliable, because there's a lot of information here for them to sift through. And so first and foremost, it's about the local nature of what we're talking about. And the first question you can see on the slide, I talk about knowing the rules of the game. That's something that I learned a long time ago, was know the rules of the game for the local municipality, the jurisdiction in which you're dealing. And that's what I mean by the most fractured country, because you said it right. There is kind of this overall unified idea of a property tax, of a tax that's based on the value of real estate. And look, how you value real estate in some ways could be said to be pretty simple. There's three basic approaches to valuing real estate. But what that looks like in each different jurisdiction can be different, can be vastly different. Like if you get into, basic appraisal methodology includes a determination by the appraiser of highest and best use. Well, in some jurisdictions, that principle is either ignored or somewhat ignored. For instance, in New York State, we don't look at highest and best use except in some very limited situations. Indiana has a statute that basically says market value in use. So that means we're not going to look at other types of use. We're going to look at the market value for that particular use. And in this case, we're talking about a hotel. Even though maybe you built, multifamily or something, and it would be a better use, a higher or more valuable use, for tax purposes, that gets ignored. And that's not true in other states. So part of this is knowing, I say location, 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 that's the broker thing. But for me, that's also important because I want to know specifically where's the property located. And then I know all these other things like the deadlines. Deadlines can be all over the place. We all think of our April 15th tax filing deadline for income taxes. Not the case when it comes to property taxes. There are deadlines in some states, like New York, for example. We have states throughout the year, depending on the jurisdiction. The process can be different, the valuation methodology and standards. So when I'm working with an appraiser, I'm giving that appraiser guidance, not on the value, that's for them to determine, but I am giving them the jurisdictional rules they need to know that would guide how they come out to a particular valuation.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And so this list that you have here are all things that people need to consider, but it gets back to the localization of this, right? And the deadlines you mentioned, like it's different for renditions, right? If you have personal property, as you mentioned before, right? You've got to make that assessment, get it in. So you really have to plan.
You do have to plan. A lot of what we do is not only having kind of a database of things like these deadlines. There may be different assessment ratios for different jurisdictions we have to track. And the sort of confounding part of this too is that they can change. Just because you got all that information one year doesn't mean that next year that isn't going to change. And the thing is that some of this information is really critical. If you miss a deadline, generally speaking, if you miss the filing deadline, you've got to wait till next year. You can't come back and you can't give an excuse why you missed the deadline. So it's super important. It's the kind of thing that keeps me up. People like me keeps us up at 3 a.m, when we get to filing time, to make sure that everything has been filed on time. And then, we can work through the substance of the case. But deadlines, very important, and they can be very different depending on where you are. And I, just to come back to the point, if I'm, most of my work, my own work, sort of, if you looked at my caseload, I'd tell you that most of my cases, most of the hotels I'm working on are in New York. I do handle portfolios that are outside of New York, but when I'm outside of New York, I'm working with somebody who's local, and it's usually somebody that I've developed a strong working relationship with over a long period of time. I know I can trust them. I know they know really better than I may know the things that need to be done, because ultimately, you've got to serve the client. So making sure things like the deadlines are met is absolutely critical.
I would not want to be the person in charge of your law firm's calendar. I can promise
Right.
you that.
It is challenging. It is challenging.
Keep us up at night. So yeah. I hate to think that we're still talking about the pandemic, but on this next slide, you make the point that there has been an impact in this area. Can you tell us what you're thinking there?
Absolutely, and it's funny you say that because every conference I go to, somehow COVID and its impact is almost like a given topic. And, I joke about how really that's an original one, but, the reality is that it does continue to be a real game changer. And particularly for hotels where, the impact on many hotels was immediate. It's not like, say, office properties where you may have leases that run for another 5, 6, 7 years and the tenant's going to keep paying. Here, the hotel industry felt it immediately, and obviously in the very first year of COVID, it was one thing, but now it's kind of changed things a bit in general. Now, some hotels are succeeding. It's a real test of the ingenuity of many hotel owners to be able to operate with increased costs, worries. People are traveling, I'd say, in different ways. And the way that I think that the sort of the ultimate real distinction here for hotels is, are you catering to the business traveler market or the leisure market? And I think that, and this is just my sense of things, I think the data is still pretty limited on this, but I think the business travel hotels really face a challenge. And that comes from the very thing that you and I are doing right now. We're talking on Zoom. You're in Texas, I'm in New York, and we didn't have to get on an airplane. I'm staying in my home tonight. I'm assuming you may be too. And so, these are the kinds of things that are happening all over the place. And I think the companies are changing the way they look at their travel budget. So that's a real question right now. And again, it goes to the bottom line. There were, before COVID, in many cities, there were a lot of plans for new hotel rooms to be added to the market. And I guess that's that's a real question, whether those are going to be absorbed and or even built.
Well, that's a very good point. But this last bullet, I think, is very intriguing. So I'm struggling, right? I'm not back up to where I was. I've tried my best to pay those property taxes, but what happens if I don't? Should I even consider that as an option? Because
right.
Talk to us about those potential consequences. I know you know.
Yeah, my quick answer when I'm asked that question, it does come up, is pay the taxes. And I don't know what it'll take for you to pay the taxes, but make sure you pay them. In most jurisdictions, the consequence of not paying the taxes when they're due is staggeringly punitive. It ranges. An interest rate on an unpaid tax, on a delinquent tax, could be 18%. In some jurisdictions around the United States, it could be as much as 36%. And then you've got penalties and other things going on. It's if there's a way to borrow the money from some other source, and I know interest rates are rising right now, but they're not at 18 or 36% yet. So I shouldn't even say yet, but they're not there. And so I think that key thing is pay the taxes. Some jurisdictions throughout COVID did make some special rules. Those were primarily aimed at homeowners, not the commercial sector, to enable homeowners to pay over time or some kind of forgiveness. But I haven't seen a whole lot. And this kind of comes back to the point that it's a fractured country. There are some jurisdictions, I think, and I'm not an authority on places like California, but I think California had some special rules on this. I think some other states may have had some options. So, you do have to check. You got to kind of ask around, and again, comes down to location. But generally speaking, just not paying the tax is a bad move.
I know that's not good news for a lot of people, but I think telling them straight, being transparent about it is the way to go. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So there's challenges. Let's talk strategy then, right? Your next slide, you talk about playing a strategic role for portfolios. Being strategic in these situations is crucial. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that from a tax management standpoint, and you can see the first bullet point, strategic tax management versus simple tax reduction services. This goes down, and one of the other points that I make on this slide is about top-down management of people like me. And when I say that, what I'm talking about, the sort of default approach, and this is not just for hospitality, this is for the entire commercial real estate industry, any owner that's got a large portfolio, the default approach tends to be what we would call bottom up. In other words, let's assume you've got a portfolio, it covers a number of states, you've got some local people that handle the taxes. Maybe you even have a national consulting firm that says that they are handling the whole thing for you, but they've got some people in the different locations in which you have property. What often happens is that they're the ones on the front line. They are coming back up to sort of the mothership saying, well, we can file an appeal here, and we'll go after this. And there tends to be maybe an over-reliance on that approach without really looking at at the portfolio as a whole and saying, look, we've got only so many resources, because even though the typical tax representative is charging the services on a contingent fee basis, there are other costs that go into this. There may be appraisal costs, other things like that. And so really the best thing to do is to have a strategic plan. Often that incorporates some form of technology. There's a lot of technology out there nowadays that helps you to manage and sort of see the whole portfolio from a tax standpoint. You get to spot where there are anomalies. You get to track and really one of the key elements of this strategic approach is having benchmarks, and benchmarking can take some time. It may take several cycles in which you look at where things have been. You're tracking what are other changes. Maybe there's physical changes going on that account for assessment changes, but it allows you to kind of in a snapshot, get a quick look, see where the real fires are that need to be dealt with. And that allows you to say, or also just to understand from a strategic standpoint, where is the tax burden the greatest? I typically, in dealing with a portfolio, I'm going to rank the properties in the order of magnitude and importance. What are the ones that I'm recommending an owner really needs to focus on, so that they're not overwhelmed with the whole thing. And so that's really what I mean. Now there is a role, all that being said, there is a role for the bit of the bottom up, and that's because somebody on the front line may see things or may anticipate changes that are important, and so you want to get that feedback. So it's not like it's just top down, but having that kind of exchange really set up in a way that from a corporate standpoint, you're driving the process. You're not just reacting to the process. I guess that's the best way to say this.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe that. And just a quick question before we look ahead, and that is, so those are strategies from a portfolio perspective. I'm assuming you guys also, from time to time, handle individual properties. Are there specific? Yeah, are there specific strategies there? We might not have enough time to go into all of them, but the answer is I hear you say yes, there are.
Yeah, sure. No, that's really our bread and butter, is dealing with the local individual properties. Big part of my day is spent on appeals, talking with owners about the best strategy for a particular case. And a lot of that does have to do with evaluating what's the best deal. And this I mentioned earlier in the conversation about sort of there's a religious attachment to value. That's our value. We've got to get it right. Sometimes there's also you have to disconnect from that a little bit and say, bottom line, the value is only a proxy for what our taxes are. So is this a tax that makes sense? Can we do better? Some of this, I've been having a series of conversations over the last couple of days where we've got a client that's selling a property. They've given me the authority to speak to all the potential bidders for that property and talk to them about the local jurisdiction. What can they expect? Is there a tax savings that they can build into their pro forma that they're building for what their bid's going to be? And that's going to impact that too. So those are the kinds of things we deal with. One of the things on the slide is tax incentives. It's not just, can we get a tax benefit in this particular jurisdiction, but is the tax benefit worth it? Sometimes the municipality may offer you a schedule of, let's say, pilot payments or something like that. But then you'll look at, they're not stupid. They're offering it because they have something in mind too, in a way that they're going to try to capitalize on the owner's, let's say, a build out or whatever it is they're planning to do. And so really to be able to evaluate, maybe compare it to what the taxes would be without taking the incentive plan or something like that. So those are all ways in which we look on an individual property basis to be able to advise owners on how to ultimately minimize their tax burden and really make a better NOI.
Very helpful. Good insight. So if we look ahead to this next slide, how does the hotel appraisal fit into all of this?
Well, you started the conversation talking really about the appraisal debate, and I don't want to go too much back into the methodology point, but it is very much about the quality of the appraisal. In some jurisdictions, you don't really need an appraisal in the sense of a full-blown appraisal. You need some sort of an analysis. Very often, a consultant or an attorney will prepare that analysis, but assuming that we're talking about, so the first point on the first bullet point is, are existing appraisals useful? Many times we're given an existing appraisal. Let's say some publicly traded companies have appraisals prepared quarterly just because it's part of what they do as asset managers. And so can we use those? You know, that as a general rule, I would say they're not helpful. In fact, they can be unhelpful in the sense that they're based on a different premise often than the property tax parameters. So they're probably prepared for a different valuation date. They may make different assumptions. I mentioned before where they may include a highest and best use analysis that may not be to the owner's advantage to use in a property tax proceeding, depending on the jurisdiction. So you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes an existing appraisal could be useful in the sense that it kind of gives you a little handle on what an appraiser thought without necessarily starting from scratch. So I like to look at them, but sometimes they can actually shoot you in the foot. So you just want to be very mindful about whether or not you want to go forward. It seems like the easy approach. Hey, we've got an appraisal here. Why don't you just use it? But very often I find that the existing appraisal ends up leaving a lot of money on the table for the owner.
Well, that's fascinating because it does kind of take us full circle, right, to how we started off this conversation. But I think most people feel like there's a use there for that, but you've pointed out some challenges with it that I think people need to be mindful of. So
it can be penny wise and pound foolish, really.
Yeah. Well, as we're nearing the end, it looks and sounds to me like at some point we need to do a cost benefit analysis. And I think you've raised that issue on your last slide here, where you say timing, knowing when to call it a day. Is that like a cost benefit, or are you saying that we need to be thinking a little differently?
Well, it's a whole bunch of things, and it includes a timing issue. So I'll give you an example right now. We're dealing with a case where we've moved a particular appeal from a point at which the municipality was offering $0 to now they're offering about $5 million. So wow. Big swing, and it's all through the negotiations. Now, in the background of that discussion is, are we going to trial or are we not? And both sides are looking at it, and I think it's fair to say that both sides are worried about the uncertainty of a trial. But if the offer is just too much to stomach, where are you going to go? And so, the threat of a trial is sort of looming there. But in this case, we get to a point where I'm telling the owner, and this is why the owner comes to me, is what do you think? And they're smart. They're really smart people there too, and they understand the valuation and the finances, but they're coming to me in part to say, if we reject this deal and we decide we're going to go to trial, what does that look like? And I'm telling them, in this jurisdiction, you're not just facing another couple of years here. You're facing appeals on appeals. Nobody's gonna like the decision, whichever way it goes. So you're gonna be stuck, and all that time you're paying the same tax level that you've been paying until it gets resolved, and you don't know how it's gonna go. So at some point, we've looked at the appraisals. Are you leaving some money on the table? It's always sometimes a compromise may not really be exactly how you saw things when you started. But it's really the best outcome. It gets you the relief you need. So that can be also a business decision. Some companies are in a position where they say it's most important for us to get this number as right as we can. And we're okay. We're okay cash flow wise and all that to hang in there and fight the fight all the way to the end. Sometimes companies will say, from a business standpoint, this is pretty good. We're going to take it. It's not everything we ever wanted, but this gets us to live to fight another day, or maybe you look at it and you say, well, yeah, this may not be the right number exactly the way we want it today, but we get to come back next year. We can keep fighting it. So there are a lot of different ways to look at the situation. And that's, and again, we have no hesitation to go forward and take the case to trial. But ultimately, what we don't want to see is that it really does a disservice to the client, is that somehow in going and doing that and being, aggressive that way, it's delayed refunds, tax refunds, and things like that so long that now the owner is struggling and would have been better off just taking the deal. So that's what I refer to in the bullet point about avoiding the pursuit of justice. This can become a situation where the both sides really can be so married, wedded to getting, I hear this all the time, that's unfair. And, it may be. There's a line, and I think it's coming from New York's highest court. It might even be a U.S. Supreme Court decision, and I apologize, I can't quite remember where it came from, but the line is, in property tax, rough equity is all that's expected, and that's about right.
Rough equity. I'm going to remember
Equity.
that.
Right.
I think it's important. Back in the day when I was practicing, it was always challenging to share with my clients that, they were just aggressive about wanting to get to the courthouse, and just trying to remind them that, with a settlement, you remain in control.
That's right.
Once you get to the courthouse, you're given all of that control up. And I find that very few people really understand the depth of the loss of control that goes once you get inside that courtroom.
That's right. And I'll add too that in some states, judges are elected, and that's not to take anything away from their brilliance. And obviously I'm speaking a little bit tongue in cheek here, but when you've got an owner that may be located in another state, and you've got a judge who's elected by the local folks in town, you kind of know that judge wants to stay in office, and so you do have to weigh these things, and it's sort of like the thing that you don't want to have to say, but it is the reality that you do have to deal with the politics of the situation too, very much when it comes to property tax and a large owner in what may be a small town.
That's fascinating, and you said that very diplomatically.
I tried. Thanks.
Hey, before we wrap up, I have a quick question that just popped in my mind about if in the litigation process, are there processes where I can deposit the money so that I can toll the interest and penalties, or how does that work? Or do those continue to run? Because with the numbers you expressed previously, gee, that could run you right out of the ballpark before it gets to trial.
Yeah, it's a great question. I can only speak from my own experience, and so when I say that just because it is possible that there's some jurisdictions that work differently than what I'm aware of, but in the jurisdictions that I've worked, you cannot sort of pay pay a portion, let's say, and almost like a good faith payment. Here's what I think it should be, and then let the rest sort itself out over time. Again, it is possible. There's some jurisdictions I'm not aware of that may allow you to do that. I can at least tell you for sure in New York, there's actually a rule, and this may be a similar statutory rule in other states, but I do know that in New York, the statute commands the tax receiver at the municipality to take exactly the amount that's billed, not 1 penny less. And so ultimately you do, and that can be a problem. And it really factors into this whole question of that's on the slide about how long does it take to resolve, when do you call it a day, because as this process is going along, if there's a significant overassessment, then the owner may have to be really well healed in order to be able to sort of gut it out over what may be a period of years till it gets resolved, maybe by a final court decision. So it is a very important question.
Yeah, but and with what you just said, it doesn't appear that I can pay the money, like you said, in good faith, because then it's paid, right?
Right.
We're not going to litigate then. So my only choice is to not pay. And then I'm assuming, David, we make the accruing interest and penalties part of the negotiation and or part of the litigation. Is that how it works?
Well, you wouldn't want to part pay. In other words, you'd pay in full, right? But then what will typically happen is that as we deal with a case, and let's say a case goes for 2 years, when it's finally getting resolved, those 2 years will typically get resolved. And so if the property was determined to be overassessed for those 2 years, the owner would get a refund back for the difference of what they paid. What's also important in most jurisdictions, you don't get it with interest. It's a common term that it's and so what you might say is it's kind of like an interest-free loan for a lot of municipalities. They're getting to collect this money. When it's paid back, they're not paying interest on it. There are some jurisdictions that handle interest differently. Plus, often if you end up going to trial, you do tend to get interest unless you negotiate it away or something, but you do tend to get interest on a judgment after trial. So that might be a bit of a motivation to say, well, why don't we just go to trial? One thing I would add, and again, this is another area where it will differ by every state, but the amount of interest, sort of don't assume that you're getting normal statutory interest. I could at least tell you in New York, statutory interest on, let's say, your, a personal injury decision or something like that is far higher than what you would get in a tax appeal. Tax appeal interest is quite low and is tied to actual interest rates out in the market. So, going after that interest is often not really the thing that's going to move the needle enough to decide whether or not to go to court.
Wow, so that makes that rough equity term you mentioned earlier really important to walk away with. So we're going to let that be the final word. Let's, David, let's put your contact information up and so everybody can know how to find you and the folks at your firm. And I just want to remind everybody that they have not just a practice in the U.S. and they can help all across the country with their local relationships, but they also have a significant opportunity to assist you in your international tax issues as well. And of course, as they talked about, both portfolios as well as individual properties. So let David and his team know at the Herman Katz firm in New York if you need some assistance. But David, thank you. That was very insightful and diplomatic when it needed to be. Any final words?
Just wanted to thank you very much, Stephen, and your whole team. Really enjoyed the conversations, a lot of fun. And, look, we love doing what we do. I love talking with investors and owners. And so I do welcome any questions, comments. I give an awful lot of free advice throughout the year, and I really enjoy that. So thanks again, Stephen.
Well, it's kind of you to do that. The industry needs wisdom like you shared with us today, so we can't thank you enough. Thank you. That'll wrap us up for today, everyone. We'll look forward to the next time we produce a video and send it your way. Thanks again, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.